F1 drivers are taking liberties, but are they really the problem, or are the rules to blame? Scott, just fill us in. What are we talking about here?
The heinous rise of the 5-second penalty and the abuse of it from F1 drivers. It doesn't seem to matter what you do anymore, whether you force another driver off the track, whether you overtake them off the track, whether you abuse track limits too much, you get a 5-second penalty. And the problem is they're way too easy to spend with the way that they're dished out in F1 and the way that a Grand Prix tends to unfold. There are some specific circumstances where a 5-second penalty can really kill your race, but too often it's too easy. The drivers know that, they're fed up with it, so they're trying to take advantage.
Now, before we get into this any further and point out or expand on some of those things that Scott mentioned there, we're going to hear from Edd Straw. Ed's currently travelling from Austin to Mexico City for the races, and he spoke to what I think we can call a reluctant offender in all of this. So let's find out a bit more about why this has come to a head now and why even the drivers who are taking advantage of this aren't happy about it.
George Russell has been right at the centre of this debate, both as one of the sternest critics of the way track limits in overtaking are policed, and also one of the worst offenders in terms of taking advantage of that. Now, Lando Norris recently revealed that at the Spanish Grand Prix, George Russell really pushed back against the race director's instructions that you could take to the runoff at turn 1. As long as you rejoined at turn 3 on the left-hand side of the bollards, you didn't have to cede places. So Russell didn't have any success with convincing a different approach should be taken. So at the start of the race, he went to the outside, took to the runoff, hoped for a net gain. Then at Monza, he overtook Esteban Ocon by cutting the track after his pit stop at the first chicane, didn't drop back behind him, took the 5-second penalty, net gain to his race, he felt, because it meant he got past the Alpine, didn't lose more time that way. Then, of course, the pass on Piastri at Cota in the sprint race, which I think was absolutely premeditated. Piastri didn't even know he was really coming because Russell was driving a completely different track, the way he gunned the throttle. So Russell, I think, is doing a Fernando Alonso, by which I mean he's pushed back, he doesn't like the response he's got, and he said, OK, you're doing it this way, you are forcing me to take advantage of it. So I think Russell is very much at the forefront of showing that this is a stupid thing that cannot continue to happen, and he wants to see the FIA penalising drivers by making them drop back behind the cars they should be behind. That's the best way to restore it as close as possible to the racing situation before the infringements.
Just to add some context there, Ed mentioned Alonso particularly. That was 2021. We did a video on it at the time after the Russian Grand Prix. Alonso was getting fed up with people getting away with cutting corners at the start of races, and he knew that was going to be a problem at Sochi at what's actually turn 2 and 3. He tried to raise it. He tried to get something done about it. The FIA didn't show enough interest, so he basically premeditated, deliberately cut the corner and took an advantage. It was a classic piece of cunning Alonso. I think we should add some background here, Scott. One of the reasons we've ended up with these 5-second penalties is that a few years ago, the lowest penalty you could get was a drive-through penalty. So pass through the pits at pit lane speed, quite a big time loss. And it was felt that there were times where it was too severe to penalise a driver that way for quite a minor offence. They said, well, let's come up with some smaller penalties. And that's where we end up with 5 and 10-second time penalties, where you don't actually do anything to serve them. You either wait until a pit stop and you get delayed by 5 seconds, or they get added to your race time. But the problem with these small penalties, Scott, is that you shouldn't be able to use them tactically, should you?
No, you shouldn't. It would be like, let's say you get a drive-through penalty for something, and because of the bizarre layout of the circuit, the pit lane is actually going through the pit lane is a way faster way of going around the track. You shouldn't be then trying to get a drive-through penalty because it's actually the quicker way to go around the lap and run your race. That's obviously a particularly extreme example, but it's kind of like if you're stuck behind a slower car, like we've seen several times this year, Russell at Monza, Sergio Perez in Singapore, you can't then use your car as a weapon, a battering ram, throw another car out of the way because you know I'll only get 5 seconds for that, but I'm going to gain 10, 15, 20 seconds in race time by just cracking on. That's not in the spirit of racing. It's not in the spirit of F1, certainly. And while there are some dark arts that drivers are right to try to master at times, like, for example, knowing that the rules of engagement with forcing another driver off the track means that as long as you get your front wheels level or in front of the other car at the apex, you can do whatever you like to them at the exit. Now, you might not necessarily like that, you might not agree with it, but you'll happily go along with it and take advantage. That's a dark art to exploit. That's fine. That's something within the realms of wheel-to-wheel racing and the accepted principles of racing. Getting a penalty, deliberately getting a penalty, because you know that that's better for your race than just trying to do something fairly, do something competitively, that's not really how F1 should be.
And I think we should say, in defence of the drivers here, they're only exploiting this system because it's there. None of them want this to stay. None of them are saying, yeah, keep doing the 5-second penalties. That is great for us. But if nothing's going to be done about it, they are going to take advantage of it. The thing for me, and I've mentioned it briefly already, it's the lack of immediacy of a penalty. If you commit an offence, your penalty should affect you at that point in the race. The fact that you can go, okay, I'm going to overtake this guy off the track because I know half an hour from now I'm going to get a 5-second penalty and he's not going to be in my race anymore. That's completely flawed. At least when we had the drive-throughs, you served it, you had 3 laps to come in. So it affected your race at that time. You couldn't build a buffer to get around that. So I think that's a big problem here. And another drawback, as you mentioned, there are situations where serving of a time penalty can become too harsh. We saw this earlier this year. I think it's Carlos Sainz in Australia had a 5-second penalty because of all the safety cars and red flags and that at the end of the race that condensed the field. What should have been a small penalty became a colossal one, and that was unfair as well. So this system is flawed, I think, across the board. But looking at the overtaking situation, because that's what came to a head at Austin, where track limits are a massive issue anyway, Scott, is George Russell's suggestion of just force us to give the place back, does that solve the issue here?
No, not when we currently have a system in which the stewards will just only dish out 5-second penalties if the person does not then give that place back. If you had we can talk about this in a little bit more detail shortly, but if you have the full use of the penalties that are available, the drivers don't know what they're going to be punished with if they don't listen to the stewards. So basically what happened, I think it was at the start of last year, the FIA basically put the onus on the drivers and the teams. They said, right, okay, we're not going to intervene over the radio and say, that was a bit sketchy, we don't think it was right, you should probably give the place back, otherwise it will go to the stewards. They put that on the drivers and the teams. Now, in theory, nice idea, because the drivers and teams can act like, okay, bit of give and take. We know that if we can't take the mick too much in this scenario, because otherwise we'll get a penalty, or someone might do the same to us at another race. The problem is drivers and teams, inherently competitive beasts. That's why they're in F1. So they're not going to listen. They're not going to do that, especially when you know that if it does go to the stewards and you do get a penalty, it's only going to be 5 seconds. Why would you willingly compromise your race by backing off, dropping back behind a car, or having to drop back behind 2 or 3 cars if there are other cars in the way between you and the driver that you overtook illegally a lap ago, a lap or 2 ago? You're not going to do that if the equivalent is just to have 5 seconds added to your race time, or wait 5 seconds at the pit stop, because you know you can open that gap up. So again, it's a nice idea in principle. There are some places and some circumstances in which that does work. We've seen it work plenty of times, either by a driver or team's action or race control intervention. But it's not going to be a good catch-all solution, because we still have a fundamentally flawed application of penalties at the heart of what we're talking about.
I always think self-policing is a risky game as well. Like you say, the teams, okay, they know they can self-police, but they're going to weigh that up against what the offence is if they don't. And what we have right now does not encourage self-policing at all. But looking away from the overtakes thing, where we can debate, should they give the place back or should they be forced to give the place back? For offences, other offences where 5 seconds isn't enough, is it as simple as saying, well, you mentioned the range of penalties they have, should we just do away with 5 seconds because it's not severe enough, and say, right, the lowest penalty you can get now is 10 seconds?
Lovely idea in principle, nice and simple. But again, I don't think we need a one-size-fits-all solution to this. I mentioned just before, we've got a nice menu of penalty options that the stewards have to dish out. You can do a reprimand if you don't want to do a competitive one, 5-second penalty, 10-second penalty, drive-through, stop and go, disqualification. You've got all of these at your disposal if you're an F1 steward. But we've got into this situation where they
never get used, do they?
No, it's because they always resort to this, well, we're going to apply the standard penalty here. There shouldn't be a standard penalty. That's what leaves us in a situation where drivers know what they're going to get and they can decide whether or not they want to spend it. Yeah, exactly. You end up gaming the system. So what you should have, very, very simply, is regardless of the offence, going off track to gain a position, forcing another driver off the track, even repeat track limits offences. It shouldn't just be a blanket 5-second penalty. Let the punishment fit the crime, because I have often been of the opinion for a very long time that it's good if you don't necessarily take the consequence into consideration, because otherwise you do end up with very, very tiny mistakes, not necessarily really egregious offences, suddenly resulting in outrageous penalties because the consequence of the action was huge. But we've gone too far the other way. It's almost like we don't take that into consideration at all now. But if you've got these range of penalties, the range of penalties exists so that you can tailor the size of the penalty to the severity of the offence. Doesn't matter what you do, but you should just get a different penalty depending on how badly you've taken the mick, broke the rules, screwed another driver over, whatever it is.
Yeah, it just feels like it's one thing to say the punishment should fit the crime, but F1's tied itself in a knot. I think by listening to the teams too much, the teams have said the punishments are too severe. So F1, the FIA have come up with these really gentle penalties that are now being taken advantage of. For me, penalties should be a deterrent. They should be harsh. They should be too harsh so that it never crosses your mind to say it's worth taking a penalty here to do this. That means the system is broken. The other problem for me, as I've mentioned a few times, is the penalty has to be served quickly. I think that it just doesn't make sense that you can build it into your race. You can plan around it almost. MotoGP, for example, has the long lap penalty. It's actually often at many tracks, they have to go off track, like totally off the track into a special designated loop. Quite often, the penalty there is less than 5 seconds. Sometimes, if they're really good at going through the loop, it's 2 or 3 seconds lost. But you have to serve it pretty much immediately, so it hurts your race there and then. Even NASCAR are doing this better than F1. I can't believe I'm saying that. NASCAR is better at penalties than F1. They had a road course race recently where if you cut a chicane, you had to pull over offline, come to a complete stop, and then rejoin. If you didn't, you got a drive-through penalty, which was really harsh. The drivers mostly obeyed that. We're not getting that in F1 at the moment because I think we've been too worried about, people are complaining because the penalties are too harsh. Don't commit offences, don't break the rules, and you won't get a harsh penalty. Anyway, that's what Scott and I think about this system. But what do you think about this system? How would you fix it? Or actually, another question, is there actually anything here that needs fixing, or is the way F1 handles it actually just fine?